My name is Shania Pagan, and this presentation is on the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, formerly known as the Islamic Jihad or Al-Jihad, and in the native language of Arabic as Al-Jihad al-Islami. I chose to cover this specific extremist group because there's typically a grouping together of extremist Middle Eastern mindsets and actions, when in this case, they are comprised of multiple groups that eventually merged together but still had their own agendas and actions committed beforehand. This is a quote from Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, an author and activist for Muslim and American relations. Jihad can mean holy war to extremists, but it means struggle to the average Muslim. What I believe Rauf is referring to is the fact that although the word jihad is used in the name of an extremist and terrorist group, the word jihad literally means a struggle or effort. The Muslim community uses the word in multiple ways. One is as a struggle to defend Islam, with force if necessary, but another way is also to build a good Muslim society and live out the Muslim faith, which preaches peace and good deeds and fights against corruption. The objectives of this presentation are to 1. Establish the origins and background and the international efforts for counterterrorism, 2. An identification of the problem and a calculation of threat levels, and 3. A projection of future threat levels and identification of targeted groups and individuals. The origins. The Islamic Jihad date back to the late 1970s, when a radical Islamist named Muhammad Abdul Salam Faraj, the man in the black and white photo, advanced the presence of the radicalized group through his work, The Neglected Obligation, which was an extremely influential text that even beyond his death aided in advancing the extremist agenda. Over the early 80s, he recruited many individuals and grew the group with the intent of assassinations and violence in Egypt. Faraj's main idea was that the jihad was being neglected by the Muslim community in Egypt, and believed that the way to fix this wrong was to attack any enemies of the faith, and he began with these apparent enemies in Egypt. In 1982, he was arrested and executed for his role in assassinating the Egyptian president of the time, Anwar Sadat. The reason that he gave for the assassination of the president was that he believed the government was not ruling according to Sharia law. The man in the picture next to Faraj is Aboud al-Zamor, who is also an Egyptian Islamist and was the former intelligence colonel for the Egyptian army. Like Faraj, he was involved with the assassination of the president, and at the time was the leader of the Cairo, Egypt sector of the militant. He was a corrupt colonel who was involved with the extremist organization and was going to use his authority in the military to gain access to the president. He initiated the infiltration of the group into the military and was able to access obviously high levels of information, as well as being able to have the ability to recruit military members to join the Islamic Jihad. Although he was sentenced to life in prison for his crime, he was released in 2011 after the Egyptian Revolution and formally apologized to the Egyptian population for what he did. The recent leaders. The man in the first picture is Syed Imam al-Sharif, who is credited for being a major contributor to spreading the extremist jihad movement globally, and the leader of the organization in 2001. But he was also involved in the assassination of the President of Egypt in 1981 and was responsible for thousands of deaths and operations of the organization. The man in the second photo is credited with being the leader of Al-Qaeda since 2011. He succeeded Osama bin Laden and before then was considered high-ranking in that terrorist organization. Like the original founders of the extremist group, he was involved in the assassinations of the president and countless deaths and attacks in Egypt. What is the goal? Broadly, the objective of these extremist organizations is to achieve and sustain the protection of the Islamic State. However, the original creators of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Faraj and Zamor, had a goal of overthrowing the Egyptian government and instilling officials they believed best represented their ideas. Extremist groups and individuals often believe that the only way to right the wrongs of those around them, who do not support or follow the faith as they do, is to punish and exert the superiority and power that they have over them. Often, this means resorting to violence, especially if to gain international attention towards a cause or event. Major successes. The extremist group was responsible for extreme violence in Egypt, killing over 1,000 individuals, successfully bombing the Egyptian embassy in Pakistan in 1995, and bombing the U.S. Embassy in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998. Their biggest success was the assassination of the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat in 1981. International efforts against violence. Many European countries, as well as countries around the world, have taken steps towards counterterrorism policies. France, for one, has been accused of Islamophobic policies due to the extreme strictness on the religion and its followers. The current president of France, Emmanuel Macron, has targeted foreign funding for Muslim community organization in hopes of fighting Islamic separatism. And most recently, the French Senate voted to ban the hijab for minors and mothers accompanying children to school events, claiming that it was oppressive and violated the rights of women. The United States has deployed and stationed troops in Middle Eastern regions since 9/11 and has strict TSA and other security regulations in order to help prevent foreign terrorist attacks from occurring. There's also the Counterterrorism and Criminal Exploitation Unit of Homeland Security, which deals with possible threats, as well as the FBI. Lastly, the United Kingdom has the established PREVENT strategy, which is aimed at stopping the recruitment and indoctrination of individuals into terrorist extremist groups. The strategy includes protecting the vulnerable population and focusing on high-risk areas and groups. The problem. The group has been responsible for many attacks from the 90s to present day in the Middle Eastern region of Egypt, Albania, Sudan, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. These have ranged from car bombings to civilian killings and the assassinations of government officials. In 2001, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad merged with Al-Qaeda, which even after the death of Osama bin Laden in 2011 has been active in Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Because the groups have merged and branched off into their own extremist and terrorist groups, the danger is still very much relevant, even if the named organizations themselves are considered recently dormant. The numbers, targets, and tools. It is estimated that there were 500 to a few thousand members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad before merging with Al-Qaeda. The group has had military connections and explosives at their disposal. The connections were an opportunity to infiltrate the military, which they did succeed at when Aboud el-Tumor, the former military intelligence colonel, spread high levels of security information to the group, which aided in the president's assassination. The targets of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad have primarily been the Egyptian government and officials in order to create a supported Islamic state. Quantifying the threat. The largest and most recent attack initiated by the organization was in 2015 in Paris, France. Referred to as the Charlie Hebdo shooting, 12 people were killed and 11 wounded at the French newspaper Charlie Hebdo office. Due to the dormancy in recent years of the organization, the threat level can be categorized as medium, meaning that the existence, capability, and history of the organization are supported through past events, but the present intention does not seem to be active. Target assessment, past and future. Combining the goals of the original Egyptian Islamic Jihad and Al-Qaeda, the targets have always been those who go against the Jihad way of thinking. This is the pursuing of living out the Islamic faith and what is believed to be the best way possible. Past targets have been government officials, civilians for bigger attention gain, the Jewish population, which was increased with the merge of Al-Qaeda, and the United States. The United States, due to their heavy influence and presence as a world superpower, has been blamed by these extremist organizations for the strife and suffering of the Middle Eastern region. Their targeting can be seen with the U.S. Embassy bombings in 1998. Diminishing power leaves future targets likely to be the citizens of the affected countries as well as local political figures. Protection for potential threats. There are no widespread protection programs or agencies in the Middle Eastern regions that would benefit the Jewish persecution, specifically in the countries. The problem with battling terrorism is some of these countries, such as Syria, Yemen, Iran, and Afghanistan, is that they are war-torn due to over a decade of conflict with the United States. As well as being impacted by nearby terrorist threats, they are also dealing with international conflicts and issues of corruption and supported violence from leaders. There are some programs and policies intended on monitoring and diminishing the overall issue. For example, the Syrian Network for Human Rights is a UK-based non-profit human rights organization which analyzes and keeps track of casualties and encounters in Syrian conflict. In the case of Iran, there is no general law or committee dedicated to fighting terrorism established in recent years, but in 2004, there was an anti-terrorism law that was submitted to the government, but has not made any progress since that time 16 years ago. Infrastructure targets. As for infrastructure targets of these extremist organizations, as previously stated, with diminished power and influence, means the victims are likely to be more local, as the original Egyptian Islamic Jihad carried out. For these reasons, I believe that synagogues and U.S. embassies would be the likely infrastructural targets. A future temporal threat projection. Based on the long-standing history of the aggressions of the extremist jihad organizations, it does not seem likely for the threat to completely disappear, although it has become less frequent in the last 5 years. The overall threat of extremist organizations wreaking havoc both domestically and abroad appears to be a long-term threat that continues to be relevant for the Middle East and regions and countries who have been targeted in the past. However, for the citizens of specifically the countries in the Middle East, as previously mentioned, Syria, Yemen, Iran, Afghanistan, Egypt, and Pakistan, these threats are still very much relevant and can be considered an imminent threat that is difficult to absolve due to the lack of condemning from officials in power. These are my pages of sources, and thank you for watching.